Thank you, Walter. Brothers and sisters, I have been asked to fill some very big shoes to stand in for Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves, and I will use the time allotted to me basically to share with you a submission that I made in writing to the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. I attended the third session of that forum in April of this year at UN headquarters in Geneva. And during the course of the session, I made this written submission entitled African and Black Majority Nations Must Lead the Way in Demonstrating that Black Lives are Precious. And I'll quote the submission. At the heart of the work of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent is the notion that not only do Black lives matter, but that Black lives are precious. But while the Permanent Forum quite rightly puts focus on human rights abuses of Black or African descended people in white majority societies, it also has to pay very close attention to what is happening in our African and Black majority societies. And the conflicts, the deadly, heartbreaking conflicts that have gone on sometimes for years and even for decades in some of our African and Black majority nations must be deprecated. The tragic loss of Black lives associated with these conflicts and the seeming cheapness of Black lives suggested by these conflicts must be profoundly deprecated and addressed. I would therefore like to suggest that, in keeping with the 1978 United Nations General Assembly resolution on the establishment of zones of peace, the Permanent Forum should advise African and Black majority nations to officially declare their geographical spaces to be a zone of peace and to prioritize peace, peacekeeping, and peacemaking in all of their national and regional affairs. And I'd just like to give you a little background on this concept of a zone of peace. The roots of this concept are to be found in a 1971 international instrument that constituted an effort to extricate a region of the world from entanglement in big power rivalries during the Cold War. I refer to the 1971 UN General Assembly Declaration decreeing the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. So the term, to the best of my knowledge, began there. However, that term was given a more universal applicability when, in 1978, the United Nations General Assembly held a special session devoted to disarmament and resolved to establish, quote, zones of peace in various regions of the world under appropriate conditions to be clearly defined and determined freely by the states concerned in the zones, taking into account the characteristics of the zone and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. End of quote. And to their credit, it was the political leaders of the Caribbean who immediately took hold of this newly established general legal concept and engaged in a process of giving it concrete and specific content and applying it directly to our Caribbean region. In October 1979, for example, at the ninth regular session of the General Assembly of the Organization of American States, Grenada, under the leadership of late Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, co-sponsored a resolution that called on all states to recognize the Caribbean as a zone of peace and to devote all their efforts in appropriate regional and international forums to the advancement of this concept. Subsequently, the Committee of CARICOM Ministers of Foreign Affairs, at their meeting in Grenada in 1981, reaffirmed their intention to have the Caribbean declared a zone of peace and established a working group to formulate measures to give effect to the zone of peace concept. The Caribbean Conference of Churches then got into the act, and in 1982, they too adopted a resolution which urged the CARICOM heads of government to establish a zone of peace in the Caribbean. And then in 1986, Prime Minister Errol Barrow, Right Excellent Errol Barrow of Barbados, in his speech to the CARICOM heads of government conference in Guyana, he emphasized that the Caribbean must be recognized and respected as a zone of peace. And finally, in the year 2014, our CARICOM member states joined together with other sister states of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states to issue the Havana Declaration, definitively designating our region a zone of peace in which the core principles of self-determination, non-intervention in the legitimate internal affairs of states, and a commitment to resolve disputes peacefully through dialogue and negotiation would be rigorously upheld, and in which a culture of peace would be assiduously cultivated. And that notion of cultivating a culture of peace is very important because it really speaks to the type of values we inculcate in our people, especially in our young people. It directs us to pay attention to what our youth are being exposed to on social media, the cultural penetration that they are facing. The idea of a culture of peace also says to us that we have to recognize that violence doesn't only come from the barrel of a gun. There's also social and economic violence. And just like a gun can scar and destroy human lives, poverty and lack of access to education and healthcare can similarly scar and destroy human lives. Culture of peace also says to us that our Caribbean, there must be no foreign military bases in our region. Our region must cultivate and promote peace and not aspects of militarism. So the point I was making to the United Nations Permanent Forum for People of African Descent was that by establishing such a zone of peace, our African and Black majority nations would therefore be making a commitment to undertake the peaceful settlement of disputes and to demonstrate a deep respect for the value and sacredness of human life. I said to the forum, let our African and Black majority nations be the leaders and exemplars in championing and holding up before the world community the notion that Black life is sacred and that all Black lives are precious. And as already noted, our community of Latin American and Caribbean states, having declared our region to be a zone of peace, there are two recent instances where CARICOM, faced with a threat to the peace of our region, we were able to deploy that concept of the Caribbean being a zone of peace to mitigate the threats. The first instance occurred in January of 2019, when in our sister Caribbean nation of Venezuela, a member of the National Assembly who had never even contested an election, a man called Juan Guaido, declared that he was president of Venezuela. And immediately, the U.S. State Department recognized him as the president. And we could see in the Caribbean community that this was headed for a major, major conflict in Venezuela involving outside forces. And so the very next day, the CARICOM held an emergency heads of government meeting. We put out a statement saying that there must be no outside intervention in Venezuela, that the Caribbean is a zone of peace, that whatever contention exists in Venezuela must be settled peacefully through dialogue and negotiation. And we immediately sent a team of 3 of our prime ministers and our Secretary General of CARICOM to the United Nations to meet with the Secretary General to make this point about the Caribbean being a zone of peace. We sent our ambassadors to the UN Security Council to emphasize this point. And ultimately, we joined forces with Mexico and Uruguay. We established something called the Montevideo Mechanism to insist that there must be a peaceful resolution to the situation in Venezuela. Similarly, just last year, when there was a major contention between Venezuela and neighboring Guyana, there's a border dispute between these two countries. And the contention was getting extremely heated. Bellicose words were being shouted across the common border. CARICOM moved into action. We collaborated with the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. We insisted that our region is a zone of peace, and that particular contentious issue had to be resolved peacefully, had to be subjected to a modus operandi of dialogue and discussion and peaceful resolution. And we brought together all of the parties in St. Vincent, at the Argyle Airport in St. Vincent, and we worked out an agreement without the imposition or intervention of any of the big powers. We came together ourselves around the notion that our region is a zone of peace, and we resolved the contention. So the point that is being made is that if we consciously designate our nations and our regions as zones of peace, and we identify what that means in concrete terms, and we commit ourselves fostering a culture of peace, it gives us a guide when contentious issues arise. It helps us to refrain from descending into violence and contention, and it guides us along the path of a diplomacy of dialogue, a peaceful resolution of whatever issue is facing us. So this is just another, of course, the African Union has its own methodologies for pursuing peace, but this is just another methodology, another instrument, peacemaking instrument that could be very useful. It has proven very useful in the Caribbean, and we
Right.
believe that it could be applied across the board of global Africa and also prove to be very valuable. Thank you
Thank
very much.